We are at war again with the Teutonic Order, but we no longer cower from their discipline and military prowess. We strive to match it. We march now on Marienburg, the Teutonic capital. Once the dust settles on the ruins of that fortress, the union of Poland and Lithuania, the wedding ring of Jadwiga, will stand stronger than ever before.
The fruits of her labor is the final chapter of the Jadwiga campaign. Taking place a decade after her death, it shows how Jogaila and Vytautas fought side by side at the Battle of Grunwald, the greatest battle in medieval Europe. Today we will explore a mission that changed a lot from the original concept to the final product. We will also talk about how to playtest and polish your scenario, to shave off the rough edges and turn it into something that other players can enjoy. Welcome to the final episode of Making Jadwiga. As you work your way through your scenario, from the storyline to the map design and the triggers, it's important not to become sloppy. If something is vital to any part of the mission, try to get it right the first time. It's easy to think that you can leave the details for later and rush through the process. However, you have to remember that even if you work through every part of the mission thoroughly, there will still be details to fix later, no matter what. Working carefully from the get-go is simply a way of minimizing the amount of bug fixing and polishing that you will have to do later, but it does not make polishing unnecessary. Polishing is the final step in designing a scenario, just as it is for any creative endeavor. This is where you take a look at everything you've accomplished and then try to mitigate every last flaw that you can find. When I'm polishing a scenario, there are broadly speaking 3 things that I'm on the lookout for. The first is trigger bugs. These are the most serious issues, as they can turn an otherwise great scenario into an unplayable disappointment. Before you release a scenario to the public, you should test it extensively and make sure that every part of it is working smoothly. Ideally, you should find other people to play it as well, as they can look at the scenario with fresh eyes and usually find issues which you yourself would have missed. Then there are balance issues. Even if a scenario technically works, it can still be frustrating to play if the balance feels off. Balance is all about tailoring the difficulty to the target audience. Official campaigns and many custom scenarios come with 3 difficulty levels: standard or easy, moderate and hard. Balance is also one of the hardest things to get right, as it's highly subjective. A professional player is always going to find even the highest difficulty far too easy, and if you tailor a scenario to this very narrow demographic, it will alienate the vast majority of players. On the other hand, if even hard difficulty is a walk in the park, experienced players may find playing it unfulfilling. When I'm balancing a scenario, I follow a rule of thumb. On standard, you should be able to win even if you seriously mess up somewhere, or if you only have a rudimentary grip on things like unit counters. But you could make it even easier if you want, and essentially turn it into a story mode. On moderate, you have to successfully apply your knowledge of the game, the civilization you're playing, and the information given to you by the objectives. If you do all of that right, winning should be almost guaranteed, but if you mess up, you run a real risk of losing. Finally, on hard, you should face a challenge even if you do everything right, but victory should never feel impossible. These are all rather vague goals, and good balance is hard to quantify. That's why playtesters can be so valuable, and it's good to have players at several skill levels, if you can find them, to test all 3 difficulties. And then we have map design issues. I normally spend very little time polishing the map design, as I tend to do what would normally be called the beautification phase in tandem with the basic design. Sometimes issues still creep in though. Perhaps a detailed city design turns out to be too cramped to work in a build and destroy, or there is an annoying choke point where you didn't plan for one to be. In such cases, you can go back and rework the design based on how it plays out in practice. And also, don't forget the birds and fishes. I always leave these for last, and sometimes I forget them entirely, so try not to repeat my mistakes. Depending on the scope of your project, polishing can take anything from hours to weeks, and the more time you spend, the fewer issues players will have when they finally get their hands on your scenario. However, it's also important not to become too much of a perfectionist. There are lots of things which you can and should improve, like bugs, grammar errors in the dialogue, and so on. But scenario design is as much a learning process as it is a creative endeavor. Especially when you're just starting out, you would have become a better designer by the time you finish a scenario than you were when you started it. So if you find yourself questioning whether the scenario is any good at all, or whether you should just start from scratch, it's time to let things go and actually release the damn thing. Remember, you can always create another scenario later, which is even better. The finale of the campaign went through a few iterations, with big changes both to the map design and the gameplay. Originally I had envisioned it as a fixed force only scenario, and this is how I first designed it. In this version you started with a large army in the western corner of the map. After subduing the Prussian heartland, you march north and take on the Teutons with approximately 300 units under your control, including any mercenaries you hired. For the first time in the campaign, you would have controlled both Jadwiga and Vytautas for the entire game, a nod to Poland and Lithuania growing ever closer thanks to their cooperation. The feigned retreat would have been a side quest for you to perform, and before the battle, as you heal up your army from the previous fights, you would have gotten a stealth side quest. This would have involved bringing a single messenger to the Lizard Union to convince them to stand down, while navigating a treacherous forest path. Most of this still made it into the final version, but it took a distinctly different form. The Lizard Union was moved to where the opening cutscene would have been, and the feigned retreat became a trigger-based background cinematic instead of a side quest. The landscape is also largely the same as in this original version, but it was expanded towards the east to better suit the build and destroy game. The more generic battlefield was also swapped for a section of the Grunwald map from Jadwiga 2, to better marry the two scenarios. The biggest change, however, was to the gameplay. The opening was changed to a build and destroy, where you race against the clock to finish as many side quests as possible. In the end, this turned into a pretty unique scenario, and at least from what I know, nothing like it has been tried in Age of Empires 2 before, in either official or custom campaigns. At the end of the scenario, you get to fight in the Battle of Grunwald. Age of Empires 2 was never designed for large-scale battles like this one, but I do think there's just something epic about having these armies with literally over 1,000 units crash into each other and just face off in one final bloody contest. Because it changed so much over time, this was actually both the first and the last scenario I designed. I didn't start recording until I had already designed a bit of the map, but the first thing I did on camera was the Prussian farming town. Next I designed the Eastern Prussian castle, which is based on the actual layout of Soldau Castle in Prussia. Next was the southern Prussian town, which is near the player's base in the final version. In the end I moved the monastery area from this town to the east, and created a new town around it. After this I filled in the gaps in the southern part of the map, and also designed the ruined monastery near Soldau Castle. Then it was time for the battlefield itself, where I designed this forest path which would have been used for the Lizard Union side quest, but which was cut in the end. The map was then expanded, and the original battlefield was replaced by parts of the map from Jadwiga 2, which much more closely resemble the actual battlefield from history. I now went to work remolding the scenario, which mainly meant moving the player starting location to the south, and changing the behavior of the enemies to suit the new gameplay. One challenge was to make the two parts of the map merge seamlessly, where the river in the east meets the lake from the Jadwiga map. This took some work, but in the end I think it turned out rather nicely. Having filled up the battlefield with roughly 1,000 units, the last thing I did was to design Vitauris' new base and fill in all the blanks in the new area to the east. After that, the final map of the campaign was finished. As I've already mentioned, this map changed a lot as I was working on it. It meant I had to cut some of the scenes which I would have liked to include, such as the opening sequence where Jadwiga and Vitauris stare down the Teutonic army, or when Ulrich von Jungingen tries and fails to hit Jadwiga's army with his field cannons. Still, the final version turned out really well, and judging from the comments I've seen from players, a lot of people really enjoyed it. And at the end of the day, that's the best feedback you can get. This marks the end of making Jadwiga, and I hope you've enjoyed following along as I've worked on these scenarios. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this series, it's that map design is a lot of fun. For me, the scenario editor has always been sort of a sandbox, where I could tell stories that didn't quite work in other formats. After many years of having it as a hobby, I was lucky enough to join Forgotten Empires in 2020 and turn map design into an actual job. But I still continue designing even when I'm not being paid for it. Right now I'm actually working on an 8th scenario campaign for the CD user patch version of the game, called The Shadows of Calpurea, which is a sequel to The Relics of Atholan from 2014. I can't really say when it will be released, but I'm hoping to get it out by the end of next year, with an emphasis on hoping. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this series, feel free to subscribe. I may not upload very frequently, but I do have some new ideas for new videos, and when The Shadows of Calpurea comes out, I will be uploading a few videos from that campaign as well. Take care, and happy designing!